Hello everyone. This is not going to be a normal video. I saw just today that Jim Shooter has passed away. Jim Shooter was a, let's say, controversial editor at Marvel, though in spite of that controversy, he's also one of the single most important people within the history of comic books. Both DC and Marvel have only in some ways been enriched by Jim Shooter's positions, but at the same time, there were some downsides to Jim. And I want to say this. Normally, when someone passes away that has a connection to Transformers, I would talk about it in whatever news video came next. Jim Shooter is unique in that they helmed an entire industry. Jim Shooter wasn't just a comic writer. Jim Shooter was the boss of Marvel at a time in which Marvel was the absolute king of the comics world. And Jim Shooter wasn't just a part of Transformers. Jim Shooter made Transformers. Now, I'm always going to give proper praise to Bob Budiansky, but Bob Budiansky was given a 6-page treatment from Jim Shooter. Jim Shooter came up with Optimus Prime. Jim Shooter came up with Cybertron. Jim Shooter came up with the basic idea of the war being fought over energy. He may not have made all the characters, but the sheer bare-bones skeleton of Transformers, the foundation that Bob Budiansky and Simon Furman and every writer or voice actor or creator to come after have built off of for over 40 years now. That was laid by Jim Shooter. And because I'm a big comic fan, and because Jim Shooter was such a heavy presence on so many characters and so many runs that I really enjoy, I've always had opinions on Jim Shooter. And there are so many things about the man that I hold with absolute respect. There's also a few things about the man that I don't particularly care for. And it would have felt disingenuous to have done a news video and just said, Jim Shooter was important and he did this for Transformers. No, he deserves a lot more than that. I'll also say this right now. This isn't me trying to mitigate a man's legacy. But I feel like there's going to be a lot of clickbait videos in the days to come. And a lot of people who are going to learn a Jim Shooter for the very first time. And they're going to get a lot of people who just want to sing praises without actually knowing what they're talking about. And there's going to be a lot of people who are going to just try to be contrarians and say terrible, terrible things. As a comic fan, as a Transformers fan, as a human being, I would like to just give you my personal views on a man I've never met. Keep in mind, I don't know Jim Shooter. I was never able to meet him. But I do have a lot of respect for him because I feel like we walked a similar path to a certain extent. So what should you know about Jim Shooter? Well, would you believe me if I told you that Jim Shooter got started in comic books, I think when he was 12. He was 12 or 13, and he got his first job selling story ideas and even full scripts to DC. And those scripts, where were they going? Were they going to some B-list superhero? No. He was being commissioned to write for Supergirl and Superman. And by the time he was 14, he was a regular writer on the Legion of Superheroes. Now, already you're probably seeing the connection, why I like Jim Shooter. Superman's my favorite superhero. So as soon as I find out that you worked on Superman, suddenly I'm a lot more receptive to what you might be doing. But the fact that he was part of the initial boom period for the Legion of Superheroes is also incredibly important. And he was doing that when he was 14. He was hired by DC while he was still in high school. He was only able to write full-time when he was on summer vacation. I want you to imagine that. Now, how is Jim Shooter able to get that job? Did he have an in? Did he have a famous relative? Maybe his uncle was an editor or something? No. He got there because he wanted it. He was hungry. he got in. Jim Shooter was born in Pittsburgh. He was a part of a very low-income family. The reason why he was writing and pursuing these leads as doggedly as he was because his family didn't have enough money to afford an engine for their broken-down car. There were nights where they went hungry. Now, I am not trying to make this about me, but this is where I want to say I have so much respect for Jim Shooter because of that. I know what it's like to have to work at 12 and 13 and 14 to support your family. I know what it's like to be the person in the family that's actually putting food on the table even though you're still in middle school and high school. Now, granted, I went about that by going into construction. He went about it by going into writing. I wish I had that type of talent. I wish I had that type of ability. But you can start to see now why Jim Shooter has always been amazing to me. The quality of writing at such a young age, and the fact that this wasn't a position given to him. He wasn't molded for this. He wasn't the child or the grandchild or the friend of some higher up somewhere. He got in because he went for it. That's a story that you can never really condemn. That's a story that you can only praise. And Jim Shooter, he went from that. He went from just grabbing any job he could. Of course, his first job, he had such a high quality. One of his first jobs was working on Superman. He built up from that to being not only the lead writer of the Legion of Superheroes, but then eventually the editor-in-chief at Marvel. Now, Jim Shooter, there were some awkward points in between. There was a time in which he tried to go to college. That didn't really work out. You know, college is not for everyone. And then there was a time in which he tried to go to Marvel. Marvel was just incredibly disorganized. He got upset with it, went away. And then eventually, when he went back to DC, he was able to work on Superman and Superboy in the Legion of Superheroes. And keep in mind, I'm not a terrific fan of the Legion of Superheroes, but it was a very well-selling comic book in the 70s. And the thing that was so interesting to me is that the Legion of Superheroes was written, at least from Jim Shooter's perspective, as if it were a Marvel comic. They were trying to emulate a lot of the success that Marvel was seeing with their characters within the Legion of Superheroes. And that's the reason why they brought Superboy back. Superboy was really kind of there so that they could compete with Spider-Man a little bit more. Now, Jim Shooter does all this great stuff with DC. That said, I think his true legacy is, and more than likely always will be, with Marvel. He went over to Marvel starting in the 70s. He joined the staff as an assistant editor. But by the time we get to 1978, he'd only been there for a couple of years, and he was already the editor-in-chief. Now, I want to point this out. When he took over Marvel, Marvel was in a real bad spot. Financially, they were going down quick. Deadlines were never being hit. There was a lot of, let's say, fraternizing between the writers and not a lot of results. It was kind of the Wild West. There was so much disjointedness across the entire company that nobody really knew what they were doing anymore. And then Stan Lee was still around. Stan Lee hadn't been editor-in-chief for a very long time. But, and I say this with all the respect in the world, Stan Lee was kind of the problem too. Because Stan, kind of like the grandpa who can't accept that he's retired, he was known for inserting himself in other people's work. So when you have Jim Shooter take over, Stan Lee had actually relocated to Los Angeles to focus more on the Marvel animation departments. And that leaves Jim Shooter in a spot where his predecessor's gone, and Stan Lee is gone, and he has this entirely massive staff that are all talented, but they are incredibly unruly. and not hitting their deadlines and not finishing stories. So what does he do? Does he get overwhelmed? Does he try to make the peace offering? No. He brings the boot down pretty quick. Listening to a lot of interviews, not only from the man himself, but also people like John Romita Jr. and John Romita Sr., both of whom have had interactions with Jim Shooter, they make it sound as though he was exactly what Marvel needed at the time. He treated people with respect, but he was also blunt, and he was direct, and he got results. He told people that deadlines were all that mattered. He, in some ways, kind of crushed the culture of the bullpen, but what he was doing was essentially just making sure everyone remembered that they were working. But moreover, he made sure that if they were going to a convention, that the writers were going to get paid, and that they were going to get first-class treatment. And he made sure that the writers were going to get royalties to a limited extent, far more than any editor at the time was offering. He made sure that if your character suddenly got action figures, or was in cartoons, or was selling like hotcakes, books just flying off the shelves, you were going to get more money for that. He instituted small changes. So changes, unfortunately, that we've not moved past today. In theory, I'd like for there to be a lot more royalties given to writers. But Jim Shooter was providing more than anyone else was at the time. And things were going well. By all accounts, even though there were some people who chafed under this new leadership, Jim Shooter did steer the ship. He was able to get Marvel to a place where it was making money again, and it was popular again, and many great runs of different heroes were all coming out at this same exact time. For instance, this is where you have Frank Miller's Daredevil come out. This is where you have Byrne's Fantastic Four come out. This is where you have Roger Stern on the Avengers. Some of the biggest runs of the most iconic series that Marvel has, it was happening under him. Secret Wars, one of the most beloved miniseries of all time. The place where we got the black costume of Spider-Man. The biggest crossover Marvel had done up to that point. Still a comic that newer fans know. I think Secret Wars has entered that same era as The Killing Joke or All-Star Superman, where even if you're not a fan of Marvel or certain heroes, you know about Secret Wars. That is under Jim Shooter. And Jim Shooter, of course, also helped with Transformers, which is great for us on this Transformers channel. The man was a talented writer. The man was a talented editor. He was also someone who let the success get to his head. He was removed as editor-in-chief in Marvel. Why is that? Well, a lot of it seems to just be general unrest in the ranks. He started overstepping. I told you before that a big problem with Stan Lee was that he just forgot, didn't realize that he wasn't there to write anymore. And Jim Shooter, very similar, would come in and have his ideas and tell people how to do it and what to do. He started forcing rewrites, he started forcing major revamps. Whenever he got an idea, he thought that it was a great idea, and he didn't have to listen to any feedback. That's the danger of being a creative. When you're a successful creative, you have so many ideas and so much less filter. Jim Shooter was now in that spot, and in the same way that he had helped Marvel, by the time that he was forced out of the position in the 90s, Marvel was in a bad spot again, due to a lot of the same issues. In a cycle, he left it almost the same exact way that he had found it. And a lot of these amazing writers, they moved over to DC. And by the time of the 1990s, DC, arguably, was putting out better stories. More financially successful stories? No, not necessarily. But better received stories. There's a reason why we joke about the 90s anti-hero in comics. And DC definitely partook. But it was Marvel that had all of the dumbest schlock. And it was to chase a bottom line, and because you had one person coming up with all the ideas, they were supposed to fill dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of comic books. And now we get to the single thing about Jim Shooter that makes it difficult for me to just outright say this man is one of the iconic creative minds of comics, and a man who helped shepherd this franchise and this medium. And that's his stance on gay characters in comics. Jim Shooter had a strict ordinance. While he was editor-in-chief, there were no gay characters in Marvel. Now, there were writers who wanted gay characters, but they had to do it quietly. This was a day in which gay baiting and queer writing and queer theory was becoming more and more common in Marvel Comics. Times were changing. They wanted to include more people. They wanted to include more types of people. And Jim Shooter was resistant to that. In fact, he wasn't just resistant, he was outright refusing to allow that to happen. I'd be remiss to not mention that he personally wrote the first story to ever feature gay characters at Marvel Comics. It's a story in which two gay men attempt to force themselves onto Bruce Banner. That was the first inclusion of gay characters at Marvel. Keep in mind, arguably the biggest comic company in the world, if not the biggest, the second biggest. I told you at the beginning of this video that I held a great deal of respect for Jim Shooter and how he found his way. You might also now see why, at the very beginning, I told you that there were things that I personally disliked about the man. Now, how do you parse that? How do you parse someone so important having such an unsavory position? To be sure, death of the author exists. It's always easiest to just say, I'm a fan of the work, not a fan of the person. And I'd also tell you, I don't know Jim Shooter as a human being. I don't know if Jim Shooter eventually was able to find peace on this. I just don't know. I can tell you as a gay man, and having a whole lot of respect for Jim Shooter, and remembering him as being someone who had a great run on Superman, and remembering that he made one of the best Superman villains of all time, the Parasite. Yeah, it really stung as a teenager, finding out his opinion on gay characters. As a gay man myself, it stung a lot more. So that's why I want to make a video like this. I think that there's going to be a lot of people who are going to make videos and just talk about Jim Shooter, and they're going to go through a Wikipedia list, and they're going to say, oh, well, he worked on Superman number 64 through number 67 until he was removed for unknown payment reasons. There's going to be a lot of that. People who are just going to kind of uncritically spout off. I also think there's going to be a whole lot of people who see Jim Shooter passed away and are going to use it as a way to try to rage bait or to be a contrarian, or they're going to focus in on the bad stuff. And to be fair, there is bad stuff. Even removing the personal opinions that he carried, it's the fact that he made that an editorial mandate. That was a part of the corporate bylaws. Writers could not include this. And by the end of his reign at Marvel, he was treating those writers poorly. He came in and made sure that they got first-class treatment. By the end there, he was doing his best to roll back some of those rules on royalties and bring back some of those salary agreements. Perhaps the story here is a warning of success. When he was young and hungry and knew what it was like to be in the trenches, he was a great leader. But as soon as Secret Wars happened, as soon as Marvel was undeniably massive again, and it was because of his leadership, maybe that's when it changed. What's the saying? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Maybe that's what happened to Jim Shooter. What I'll say is, by all accounts, once he left Marvel, he worked on some smaller companies like Broadway and Valiant. And in conventions and interviews he'd give, he was always a very charming man and seemingly a very down-to-earth man. To be sure, a way that you acted in a certain position at a certain time of your life doesn't define who you are. I like to think that I'm a pretty level-headed person. If I were to wake up tomorrow and be told that I'm the reason as to why Spider-Man just sold 1 million copies, and everybody wants an action figure of Spider-Man in a black costume, and I'm the editor that made that happen, yeah, I'd probably have a pretty high opinion of myself, at least for a couple days. That's the danger of success. Success robs you of the lessons you've learned. You learn when you fail. When you succeed, you get soft. I tell you all this because Jim Shooter legitimately helped shape a medium that helped get me through life. He worked for my absolute favorite superhero. He's the reason why some of my favorite runs on the Fantastic Four and Daredevil and the X-Men ever happened. He's the man who brought me Transformers. He's the reason as to why one of the people who was the absolute most important things to ever happen in my life, he is the reason as to why I met them. Because Jacob loved Transformers. Our relationship only began because of Transformers. Well, Transformers doesn't exist without Jim Shooter. It's strange to think that a man who would have vehemently denied having any type of gay character in his writings, it's strange to think that something he made is what led to the single best relationship I ever had. That's the issue with trying to simplify things in life. People are complicated, and moreover, history is a tangled mess. I make this video because I think Jim Shooter legitimately is one of, if not the most important people in comic books. Especially if you want to focus on Marvel history. His achievements, and also some of his failures, are without equal. I think that everyone should be allowed to know about Jim Shooter, but moreover, I think everybody should know the full story. Jim Shooter wasn't a dream maker who weaved gold every second of the day. He also wasn't a short-sighted tyrant who came in and destroyed a perfectly good company. He did help save Marvel. He also nearly put it in the ground again. Life, a lot of times, is just a series of ups and downs, and Jim Shooter could probably tell you that better than anybody. And now that he's passed away, it just makes me reflect on all this. It amazes me to think that someone so important to so many different franchises and so many different characters, he also, just over a weekend, made Transformers. Just over a long holiday, wrote out Optimus Prime, Cybertron, Energon, doing this for energy. All the cars are good guys, all the jets are bad guys. And then Bob Budiansky built off that, and now 40 years later, I'm surrounded by all of these toys and have made all of these videos and am doing all this stuff effectively, still building off the foundation that he poured. I have a great deal of respect for Jim Shooter. I have a great deal of apprehension admitting to that respect in some ways. But people are complicated. I can admire a work ethic without having to admire the person or the entire sum of the person that it's a part of. Jim Shooter helped usher in this mainstay success of Marvel. Without him, there's no Secret Wars. With no Secret Wars, there's no big action figure boom for Marvel. No big action figure boom. The X-Men probably don't become the biggest thing of the 90s. X-Men don't become the biggest thing in the 90s. Then you don't get the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies or the MCU. For better or for worse, comic books were legitimized and made the forefront of entertainment under men like Jim Shooter. And that's not opinion. That's not conjecture. That's just reality. So, with all that said, it breaks my heart that Jim Shooter's passed away. I hope that at the very least it was peaceful. And I hope that this video can help inform at least a few of you about who the man was. I hope that it drives you to want to go and do your own research and read some of his books, because his books still hold up. He still made one of the best Superman villains ever. He is still one of the best writers to ever touch the Legion of Superheroes. Jim Shooter will always be baked into the heart and soul of the comic book industry. And that's not a good or a bad thing. There's good and bad parts to it. But it's there because he worked. It's there because he pushed. It's there because he set his mind to it. And for better or for worse, he was sitting at the very top of the comic book industry for a very long time. And even all these years later, we remember the works he was a part of. That's going to be his legacy. And, at the very least, everyone here on this channel can remember him as the man who made Optimus Prime.